Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. It is that time of the year once again, so I apologize for my appearance. We're checking out all of the safe houses in Coruscant, making sure the world's stocked, because who knew that providing ethically sourced Ewok meat to the masses at a really competitive price was a crime against the Empire? But anyway, today I want to talk about a very interesting topic that's been on my mind for quite some time, and that is the institutionalization of super beings. It's something that comes up in a lot of fictional tales about superheroes or magical beings. You have Charles Xavier's School for the Gifted Youngsters, Sir Reginald Hargreaves' Umbrella Academy, Derek Zoolander's Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good, and of course, the Republic's own Jedi Order. Now, these organizations tend to be somewhat romanticized by their contemporaries. I mean, growing up, who wasn't dying to find out which Hogwarts house the Sorting Hat would put you in? Now, this is all designed to somewhat hide the darker truth about the institutionalization of these super beings, these X-Men, wizards, male runway models. They're all being separated from society not to better their lives, but to protect the average individual from some kind of perceived threat. And this is very much because of the powers they have and how that affects their relationship with society. If you're like a normal, well-adjusted person like me who drinks 10 cups of coffee every day, then you probably create threat assessments on a daily basis. Like when we wake up and take a look outside our window, is it going to be a nice sunny day today, or can we expect a class 5 Tyranid spore shower? There's certain things we can get used to. If you live in a city, loud noises, crazy traffic, and crazy people trying to dance fight you stops phasing you after a while. It just all becomes background noise. But when it comes to living among super beings, people with special powers that make them objectively stronger and therefore more dangerous than the general population, that is not something you can simply ignore. Especially in the case of us humans whose attention is hardwired to focus on threats. And that's why YouTube algorithms and social media algorithms in general love bombarding our feeds with things that will scare us, because they know that our attention will be focused on it, and that helps them generate ad revenue for the advertisers. And so naturally, in the Star Wars galaxy, when you have a concept like force sensitivity, it becomes very natural for a certain percentage of the population to develop fear and mistrust of these deity-like beings who can manipulate the world around them through this energy field. It's not all that different from seeing a person who has an unreasonable concentration of political power or wealth or toilet paper. Most societies and institutions are driven by this relatively vague concept of fairness. And, well, a person being able to lift objects with their mind and make people soil their pants with a mere suggestion with their mind definitely violates that idea that we're all on the same level. And of course, because the idea of being a Force user, a Jedi or a Sith, is so interesting, so romanticized by the media, there's a lot of attention paid to these figures, which increases how often they live in people's minds rent-free. Now, just statistically speaking, there is going to be Force users who are going to be bad people, because being a Force user does not make you a god, does not make you, morally more, superior than other individuals. These are basically normal people who have midichlorians in their bloodstream. There's really nothing else that separates them from the average person. And so you have individuals like Vitiate or Sidious that comes along every 1,000 years or so, and then you have lesser evil individuals who are always going to be found. Now, just statistically speaking, there will eventually be Force users who are, epically horrible people. I think Vitiate or Sidious and every wannabe in between them, these are going to be individuals who do horrific things to people, wipe out entire planets with super weapons, suck the life energy out of their followers, and create endless chaos and war. And even if these individuals outnumber the good or neutral Force users, it really doesn't matter. Because all it takes is one massacre, one horrific action, and that event becomes seared into the minds of every man, woman, and child. This reminds me a lot of the controversy around automated driving, because the idea of a robot driving us around is very novel, it's very exciting, and also scary at the same time. So there's a lot of attention focused onto it. But statistically speaking, I wouldn't be surprised if automated driving right now is already safer than the average human being. I mean, that is just because we don't pay attention. We have phones. A lot of us, I think, are under. I also think that the driving culture in America is disappearing, right? For better or worse. And so, people are clearly horrible drivers, and I wouldn't be surprised if that an AI robot crashes maybe 10, 20, 30 times less than the average person, but it doesn't really matter. As long as there's one crash, one big televised crash where I don't know, a Tesla or Waymo kills a bunch of people, it will be a significant setback for the entire technology. Same thing goes for a Force user. You just need one asshole to kind of ruin it for everyone. I mean, statistically speaking, it's highly unlikely for the average citizen of the Republic or the Empire to ever run into a Force user. You're far more likely to actually get killed by a pirate or bandit than get sliced in half by a Jedi or Sith. But banditry and criminality is just a side effect of kind of weak federal policy. It's a relatively boring and common issue. Yes, it affects a lot of people, but yeah, it's common. And more importantly, it's not as sexy or scary as the idea of some uncontrolled Force user going around taking over things and, killing people. And so this dynamic, this cognitive dissonance, I guess you could call it, is at the root of every attempt to institutionalize super beings, I think. Sure, the official narrative from organizations like the Jedi Temple or the Sith Order is more positive and talks about teaching these individuals how to properly wield the Force, but the underlying tone, the vibe is always one of fear, in my opinion. So what is the point of institutionalizing the Jedi? Well, let's take a look at the first example of a Jedi-like institution. According to legends, originally some mysterious force gathered Force users from all across the galaxy and deposited them on the planet of Tython. Interestingly enough, the Force users in this society made up the majority of the population. As a matter of fact, it became very apparent that this planet, Tython, was so dangerous that only people who had a connection to the Force should really be living on this planet. So a lot of the non-Force users in this original group would go to other planets. And so at least originally, the first institution established by the ancestors of the Jedi, known as the Jedi, was designed to create community and foster cooperation and education amongst Force sensitives. It wasn't really designed to kind of govern how the Jedi interacted with normies. This is overall very open-minded and flexible kind of organization, right? A lot of it is about learning. A lot of it is about kind of decentralizing the power of the organization to individual Jedi temples, which all taught different things. Like you kind of went on a pilgrimage to different temples. Very cool little thing to do. And these Jedi were also fully aware of the problems of the dark side, and interestingly enough, they also recognized problems with people who were too focused on the light side. But the way they treated this imbalance, I think, is a lot more holistic and probably less damaging. Whenever they found a Force user who was basically going too far to one side of the Force, they were placed in exile on one of the Force moons at Tython, where they could be submerged in the opposite side of the Force and find balance once again. There's no punishment, there's no shaming. It's just like a buddy telling your friend, hey man, you've gone a little too extreme over the years, you're posting too much crazy shit on Instagram, you need to chill a little bit here, read the opposite side of the political view that you follow. Hopefully this will straighten you out. I wish more of the world worked like this instead of people being so combative with one another. And so instead of banning the dark side entirely, like later renditions of this organization, the Jedi encourage each individual to find their own balance. And once again, you see there's a decentralization of responsibility, right? You're not just following codes, you're not just following regulations that say you can't use the dark side. It's more like it's up to you. You can use the dark side, but if you reach this point where you become a problem, we're going to step in and we're going to try to help you. But that's basically it. It's not a very restrictive organization whatsoever. This is really an organization that is designed to help people grow and become better, which is what you want to see out of most institutions. And so because most of these Jedi had practice with both the dark side and light side of the Force and were mentored on how to combat the powers of both sides, they're much better adjusted individuals, in my opinion, than the late Jedi Order. This is also why the Jedi managed to operate for thousands of years without any major schism. The first Jedi schism actually occurs after the Jedi joined the Republic, which is the political entity that rules over the entire galaxy. Well, actually, it's called the Old Republic, technically speaking. At the time, the Old Republic government was desperate for help, and in the Old Republic's defense, a lot of the problems they were facing were from these dark side Force users that had split from the Jedi. And so, naturally, the Jedi were seen as a solution to this problem that they kind of created. The Old Republic even tried to bribe the Jedi to build a fortress on Coruscant by giving them a large plot of land for free in prime real estate area. This ends up, of course, being the Jedi Temple, which better fits the pacifist ideology of the Order. But it's really telling that the political leaders of the Republic wanted the Jedi to build a fortress there. They wanted a military presence, but of course, what the Jedi wanted was just a place to understand the Force and study their own spirituality. Now, during the Old Republic era, there were several great schisms that occurred in the Jedi Order. This happened when dark side curious Jedi disobeyed the Order's banning of the use of the dark side of the Force. The Jedi, who were now a symbol of peace and stability, faced pressure from within the organization and also from the political leadership to maintain control over these dark side Force users in their organization. As we mentioned, there were many great wars fought during the Old Republic era, and usually it was the Sith or some proxy of the Sith that are doing all the damage. And so the Jedi had to really deal with this imaging issue that potentially some of their own members could go crazy and become an enemy to the Republic. And so this was something that was really on their minds. And I think this really shaped how they created the Jedi Code in a very detrimental way. And so the Jedi adopted this stricter Jedi Code that focuses specifically on preventing people from joining the dark side. But as we all know, punitive measures without being combined with rehabilitation or just changing the mindset of the affected individual doesn't always lead to a better outcome. But unfortunately, that's how the Jedi approached the dark side. It was all about restriction and censorship and shaming and punishing people instead of understanding why. Why can't you touch the dark side or let the dark side touch you? Show me on this doll where it touched you, Alan. And in the Jedi's defense, I think it's quite hard to enforce morality at the institutional level. By its very nature, the rules used by an institution are going to be rigid, relatively crude tools for maintaining order and stability. They're just not going to work for every situation. Sometimes disobedience is the right course of action. Sometimes that is the morally right thing to do, like when Count Dooku attacked that senator who was exploiting his sector and starving them. One could also argue that Qui-Gon Jinn should have disobeyed the Jedi and saved Shmi Skywalker from slavery. Ultimately, there's just too many different types of individuals, too many personalities, too many situations that they can get into to properly govern everything with just a code. This is why I've always seen the Jedi Code or any system of rules as just a baseline or floor when it comes to ethics and morality. The ceiling of what an organization can achieve is usually dependent on individual action and the ability of that individual to look way beyond procedure and regulations. But ironically, the best way to make sure a person is well adjusted is not by having them follow a dogmatic set of rules, but by making them understand the underlying reasons why we have those rules. We used to have an old saying in the videography profession that first learn the rules of composition, learn the rules of thirds before you break them, so that when you do break them, you're not just doing it because it feels right, but because you understand why you need to break those rules and what kind of message that sends to the audience. Nurturing the individual, making them understand why these rules exist is very important, but sadly in many cases institutions rely on rules in a very lazy and disengaged way. And the Jedi unfortunately aren't all that different. Not only do individual Jedi still break the code, they also fall through the moral floor and bring great shame to the organization because they don't really understand why they should be following the code. They just follow it blindly. As the Jedi became more and more involved with the Republic over the millennia, they also started becoming more connected to the political and economic centers of the galaxy. The Jedi were even commonly used as diplomats to settle trade disputes, and eventually they began serving in the Grand Army of the Republic as commanders. At this point, they were no longer just a spiritual organization. The Jedi had effectively become a branch of the Republic government, a branch that had no transparent funding and very vague relationship with the political centers of the Republic. The increased visibility that the Jedi had in the power structure also led to more and more restrictions on individual Jedi behaviors, which of course only put more pressure on the Jedi, who are now honestly tackling jobs they weren't trained for, and they were constantly being overwhelmed because of this. When the Jedi started their organization, remember, they were really focused on growth and development, something you'd want to see from an education system or school curriculum. What the Jedi were at the end was essentially a militarized enforcement wing of the Republic. Their proximity to Palpatine had completely corrupted the institution. It was no longer about bettering or creating growth for the individual Jedi, but it was about service for the Republic. No longer were the Jedi just focused on their own spiritual connection to the Force. As a matter of fact, I think most Jedi during the Clone Wars didn't have any time to do that at all. Instead, the Jedi were focused on making battlefield decisions. And the High Command of the Jedi Council were making political decisions that had huge consequences, like commissioning the assassination of Count Dooku. And this is exactly what the Sith wanted for the Jedi, to be more heavily associated with the political world, one of the dirtiest and most difficult realms in the galaxy, filled by liars, cheaters, and scoundrels of all types. Having the Jedi involved in politics is already problematic because they are not elected officials. They're kind of just recruited out of the general population through very sketchy ways, and so having them fully engage in politics yeah, that's always going to create moral hazard. The sad thing is the Jedi were always known for their individual moral compasses, and for the most part, the average Jedi Knight and Master did a lot of good while journeying across the galaxy. They essentially were posted at police stations all across the galaxy where they handled local crime. I mean, that was the best part of the Jedi's work. But as Palpatine rose up in power, he would convince Chancellor Valorum to use the Jedi more as diplomatic envoys that could solve trade disputes and negotiate M&A activity between companies. No, I'm serious. That was actually a real thing. Yeah. The Jedi were also forced to abandon some of the poorest and most underserved areas of the galaxy for helping essentially the richest people in the galaxy get richer. This isn't the fault of the individual Jedi or even the fault of the Jedi leadership. It was just a vulnerability that no one had thought to exploit for the longest time because the Jedi had a very kind of loose, unofficial relationship with the Republic. They were basically, sent to places where they were most needed, and no one ever thought about exploiting this, except for the Sith. The further institutionalization of the Jedi Order combined with a more dogmatic belief system ultimately led to a downfall for the organization. As the rules became more strict, it either became harder for individual Jedi to follow the rules, or equally as bad, the Jedi stopped thinking critically for themselves and just allowed the Jedi Code to do all the thinking for them. I think the old Jedi Order would have treated individuals like Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin with a lot more respect, and they probably would have been much more accommodating. But in the new Jedi Order, Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin were immediately labeled as threats because of their out-of-the-box thinking. Ultimately, the downfall of the Jedi was very predictable. I mean, it was always odd to see the Jedi involved in trade disputes and arguing about politics. It just seemed not really appropriate. My argument has always been that organizations like the Jedi function best in a vacuum, where they are as far away from the rest of us normies as possible, where they don't pose a threat, whether real or not. People with special powers are always going to be subjected to fear from the masses. It's kind of unavoidable. Or, in an even worse scenario, people with superpowers will be, exploited by malicious individuals. The institutionalization of such individuals oftentimes creates structure and a sense of belonging. The Jedi Order essentially attracted all the Force users in the galaxy and placed them in one place, where they, of course, could systematically be targeted and destroyed by Palpatine. And so remember, an institution is just a group of people organized around a goal. And its best, like a fire department or a Japanese dolphin fishing crew, it serves the public interest and protects lives. Institutions are only as good as the people inside of them. And yes, while, most of you guys out there are probably dumber than hammers, it's because society wants you to not think for yourself. They want you to follow rules and obey. I personally will always trust the individual and their instincts, their sense of right and wrong, more than I trust a rigid system built to manage averages. When you're dealing with an individual, there's an actual conversation going on there, and even if they do something that you dislike, you can still have empathy and understand why they've come to that solution. There's an intimacy there that is missing from an organization which does everything in its power to limit its own responsibility. So when you're in your next job, your next school, or your next unit, whatever, keep in mind the rules you follow were written for the lowest common denominator. It's not to say you should never follow the rules. Always understand the consequences of breaking the rules. They're not always built to handle the complexity, compassion, or conscience required from daily life. And that's where you come in. You have autonomy. You have the capability of individual thought. You have your own moral and ethics. And oftentimes, it's you, the individual in that institution, that is the last line of defense between doing what's right versus doing what's wrong. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.